I've always found that the best way to clear my head is to get as far away from the city as possible, which is exactly why I booked that tiny, isolated cabin up in the high Uintas for a long weekend in late October. The drive itself took nearly 6 hours, most of which was spent on winding dirt roads that kicked up so much dust I could barely see the pines lining the ridges. By the time I reached the trailhead where I had to park my car, the sun was already dipping behind the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. I hoisted my pack, feeling the familiar weight settle against my hips, and started the 3-mile trek into the brush where the cabin was supposedly tucked away. The air was getting thin and bitingly cold, the kind of chill that sinks into your marrow the moment you stop moving. I didn't see another soul on the trail, which was exactly what I wanted, though the silence of the woods felt heavier than usual that evening. When I finally rounded the bend and saw the cabin, it looked exactly like the photos. A small, silvering timber structure with a slanted roof and a narrow porch. It sat in a clearing surrounded by ancient, gnarled aspens that shivered in the rising wind. I fumbled with the lockbox on the door, my fingers numb and clumsy from the hike, until the key finally turned with a heavy, metallic click. The interior smelled of wood smoke, old wool, and the faint, sweet scent of dried rot that always seems to permeate these remote places. I didn't bother with much of a dinner, just a cold sandwich and some water, before I started a fire in the small cast-iron stove to ward off the mountain chill. The cabin was a single room with a lofted bed, and as the flames began to crackle, the shadows on the walls danced in a way that made the space feel both cozy and strangely crowded. I spent an hour or so reading by the light of a single battery-powered lantern, trying to ignore the way the floorboards groaned under the shifting temperature. Every now and then, a branch would scrape against the roof, sounding uncomfortably like a fingernail dragging across the shingles. I eventually climbed the ladder to the loft, tucked myself into the heavy sleeping bag, and listened to the wind howling through the chimney. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the settling of the house and the occasional distant snap of a breaking branch outside. I woke up once in the middle of the night, convinced I had heard the sound of the front door latch clicking. But when I peered down from the loft, everything was still and the door was bolted tight. I told myself it was just the altitude playing tricks on my ears, and eventually drifted back into a heavy, dreamless state. When I finally woke up for good, the sun was streaming through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I felt refreshed, despite the uneven sleep, and headed down the ladder to start a pot of coffee on the stove. I decided to step out onto the porch to check the weather, and that was when I noticed it sitting on the small wooden bench next to the door. It was an old Polaroid Sun 600 camera, the plastic casing scuffed and gray with age, looking completely out of place against the rustic wood. My first thought was that the previous guest must have left it behind, and the owner simply hadn't noticed it during the last cleaning. I picked it up, feeling the surprising weight of it, and noticed that the film counter on the back showed that several shots had already been taken. There was a small stack of developed photos tucked into the carrying strap, their white borders yellowed slightly at the edges. I figured I would just set them aside, but curiosity got the better of me as I began to flip through them while leaning against the porch railing. The first photo was a simple shot of the cabin from the tree line, taken during the day, likely by a previous hiker. The second photo showed the front door, slightly ajar, with the interior of the cabin visible as a dark, inviting rectangle. The third photo made my stomach do a slow, nauseating flip. It was a shot of the interior, specifically the cast-iron stove with the fire I had built the night before glowing brightly through the glass. I felt a cold sweat break out across my neck as I realized the photo had to have been taken while I was sitting just out of frame, reading. My hand started to shake as I turned to the fourth photo, which showed the ladder leading up to the loft, taken from the center of the room. The fifth photo was a close-up of my hiking boots, which I had left by the door, but the angle was from directly above them, as if someone was standing right over them. I didn't want to look at the last two photos, but my thumb moved almost of its own accord, revealing the sixth image in the stack. It was a shot taken from the edge of the loft, looking down at my face as I lay fast asleep in the sleeping bag, my mouth slightly open. The flash had washed out my skin, making me look like a corpse wrapped in nylon, and the timestamp on the bottom of the photo was from 3:14 a.m. My heart was hammering against my ribs, so hard it felt like it might bruise, as I looked at the final photo in the stack. This one wasn't of me, but of the very spot I was standing on at that exact moment, taken from inside the cabin through the screen door. I slowly turned my head to look through the mesh of the door, my breath hitching in my throat as I scanned the dim interior. Everything looked exactly as I had left it, the coffee pot just beginning to whistle on the stove and my book lying open on the table. Then I noticed the small, dark gap in the floorboards near the base of the wood stove, a crawl space access panel that I hadn't seen the night before. The panel was slightly askew, just enough that a sliver of total darkness was visible beneath the floor. I stood frozen on the porch, the Polaroid camera feeling like a lead weight in my hand, as I realized the camera hadn't been left there by a previous guest. It had been placed there this morning after I woke up, while I was busy in the kitchen area with my back turned. I didn't hear a sound, but I could feel the weight of eyes on me from somewhere inside the cabin I had thought was my sanctuary. I backed away from the door, my boots thudding softly on the porch wood, not daring to take my eyes off that dark gap in the floor. My car was 3 miles away, a distance that suddenly felt like an eternity across open, exposed terrain. I realized then that I hadn't heard the door click in my sleep. I had heard the floorboards beneath the bed being moved. The person who took those photos didn't leave through the front door when they were finished. They had simply retreated back into the dark space beneath the house to wait for me to find their work. I dropped the camera, the plastic cracking on the porch floor, and began to run toward the tree line without looking back. Every shadow between the trees looked like a person standing perfectly still, watching my desperate flight through the brush. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my lungs burning from the thin air and the sheer terror of the realization. As I fumbled with my keys, I looked back at the mountain, the cabin now a tiny speck hidden among the vast, indifferent pines. I knew that even if I called the police, by the time they got there, the crawl space would be empty. The most terrifying part wasn't that someone was in the cabin with me all night. It was the fact that they wanted me to see the photos before I left, as if they were marking a successful hunt. I drove away, the gravel spraying beneath my tires, but I couldn't shake the feeling of the flash going off in the dark. I still can't sleep in total darkness, and I find myself checking the floorboards of every room I enter. Sometimes I think I hear the faint, mechanical whine of a camera motor, resetting in the silence of my own home. I know it's just my mind playing tricks, but I haven't looked at a photograph of myself since that day. I'm too afraid of what might be standing in the background, just our focus. The woods are quiet now, but the silence no longer feels like peace. It feels like a held breath. I haven't gone back for my gear, and I never will. Some things are better left in the dark, beneath the floorboards, where they belong. But every time I close my eyes, I see that photo of myself sleeping, and I wonder how long they stood there before they pressed the button. And more importantly, I wonder why they decided to let me leave at all. There is a specific kind of dread that comes from knowing you were completely vulnerable to another human's whim. It stays with you, a cold knot in the pit of your stomach that never quite thaws. I stay in the city now, where the lights never truly go out and the noise is constant. But even here, in the middle of a crowd, I find myself looking for that specific shade of yellowed Polaroid film. I think they are still out there, somewhere in the quiet parts of the world, waiting for the next person who just wants to be alone. I should have known that true isolation is an illusion in a world full of people. Now I just wait for the sound of a shutter click in the dead of night. It hasn't happened yet, but the waiting is almost worse than the event itself. I keep the lights on, but the shadows still find a way to stretch. There is no such thing as a safe place, not really, just places where you haven't been found yet. I've always been the type of person who finds a strange kind of comfort in the sort of isolation that would probably make most people lose their minds within 48 hours. There is something profoundly grounding about being in a place where the only schedules that matter are the rising sun and the gradual cooling of a wood-burning stove. That was exactly why I'd rented the cabin out in the deep, unmapped pockets of the Cascades, a structure made of heavy, ancient logs that looked like they had been growing out of the earth for centuries. The first day was perfect, filled with the smell of old cedar and the kind of silence that feels heavy in your ears, thick enough to touch. I spent most of the afternoon chopping wood and stacking it against the porch, enjoying the way the dry air bit at my lungs with every deep breath. By sunset, the sky had turned a bruised, sickly shade of purple, and the local radio station I'd been picking up on a faint signal warned of a massive pressure system moving in. I didn't mind the idea of being snowed in or trapped by rain, because I had enough canned goods to last a month and a stack of books I'd been meaning to read for years. The wind started as a low whistle through the eaves, a gentle reminder that the world outside was changing, while I remained safe and dry behind thick walls. It wasn't until the sun had completely disappeared and the first heavy drops of rain began to hammer against the tin roof that I felt the first prickle of unease. It was a rhythmic sound, at first easily mistaken for a branch tapping against the exterior, but it was too heavy, too deliberate for that. I sat by the fireplace, nursing a lukewarm coffee, and listened to the way the storm seemed to swallow the entire forest in one hungry gulp. The rain turned into a torrential downpour, the kind that turns the ground into a slurry of mud and pine needles, making the world outside the windows look like a gray, smudged painting. Around midnight, that tapping sound evolved into a slow, methodical rasping, a noise that sounded like someone was dragging a heavy, serrated blade across the rough bark of the logs. I told myself it was just the wind whipping a loose piece of flashing, or perhaps a dead limb that had caught on the roofline. But the sound didn't stay in one place. It moved, starting at the north corner and slowly, agonizingly, tracing the perimeter of the cabin toward the front door. I stayed in my chair, paralyzed by a sudden, irrational fear that if I moved, whatever was making that sound would know exactly where I was. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a wounded animal, but even through the roar of the gale, I could hear that heavy, wet dragging sound circling the house. By the time the sun should have risen on the second day, the sky was so choked with clouds that it remained a dismal, perpetual twilight. I tried to look out the windows, but the glass was frosted over from the sudden drop in temperature and smeared with mud from the driving rain. Every few hours, the scratching would return, a deep, resonant gouging sound that made the very floorboards beneath my feet vibrate with a low-frequency hum. It felt massive, whatever it was, something with enough weight to make the cabin groan under its proximity. Yet it moved with a terrifying, calculated patience. I spent the entirety of that second day huddled in the center of the living room, far away from the walls, clutching a kitchen knife that felt pathetic and small in my hand. I tried to convince myself that it was a bear, maybe one that had been displaced by the storm and was looking for a way inside. But bears don't circle a structure for 12 hours without trying to break a window. They don't move with a steady, bipedal cadence that suggests a heavy, labored gait. And they certainly don't stop right outside the door to wait in silence for 20 minutes at a time. The power went out late that afternoon, the sudden death of the refrigerator's hum leaving me in a silence so absolute it felt like I was buried alive. Without the white noise of the appliances, the scratching sounded closer, more intimate, as if the person on the other side was only inches away from my back. I could hear the wet squelch of boots in the mud, a sound that was far too human to be anything else, yet the weight behind each step felt immense, like a giant leaning its shoulder against the house. Night fell again, and the storm reached a new level of fury, the wind shaking the cabin until I feared the roof might simply peel away like the lid of a tin can. I didn't sleep. I couldn't because every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those long, sharp gouges being carved into the wood just a few inches from my head. The third day was a blur of exhaustion and sensory deprivation, the constant drumming of the rain turning into a dull, pulsing ache in my temples. I had stopped eating. My stomach knotted into a tight ball of dread that made the very thought of food feel nauseating. The scratching had moved to the windows now, a duller, more persistent sound of something heavy and blunt pressing against the glass, testing its strength. I realized then that the person outside wasn't trying to get in. Not yet. They were marking the cabin, tracing its weaknesses, claiming the space as if it were an object they were preparing to open. I found myself talking to the empty room, whispering pleas for the storm to break, for the sun to come out and burn away whatever was haunting the perimeter. The clouds remained thick and suffocating, a gray shroud that seemed to have erased the rest of the world entirely. I began to notice a smell, something faint at first but growing stronger as the third night approached, a scent of wet wool, old copper, and something sharp and metallic, like rusted iron. It was coming from the vents, or perhaps through the gaps in the logs, a heavy, oppressive odor that made my throat feel tight and restricted. I retreated to the small bedroom in the back, the only room with a deadbolt, and pushed the heavy oak dresser in front of the door. I sat on the bed in total darkness, listening to the storm scream, waiting for the inevitable moment when the scratching would stop and the breaking would begin. And then, around 3 in the morning, the sound did stop, replaced by a silence so sudden it felt like a physical blow to the chest. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I was sure it could be heard through the walls. For an hour, nothing moved, and I dared to hope that the storm had finally driven the intruder away, or that they had simply grown bored of their game. But then I heard it, a soft, wet clicking sound, coming from directly underneath the floorboards where I sat. It wasn't the sound of a beast or a random animal. It was the distinct, mechanical sound of a hand-cranked drill biting into wood. Someone was beneath the cabin, in the narrow, lightless crawl space, and they weren't scratching anymore. I felt the vibration of the bit coming through the pine planks, just inches from my heel, a steady, rhythmic penetration of my only sanctuary. I scrambled off the bed, backing into the corner of the room, my eyes wide and straining to see in the pitch black. The drilling stopped, and then I heard a voice, muffled by the wood and the insulation, but unmistakable in its clarity. It wasn't a growl or a scream, but a low, conversational mutter, as if someone were reciting a list of names to themselves. The storm finally began to break in the early hours of the fourth day, the wind dying down to a low moan, and the rain thinning into a fine, freezing mist. I waited until the first sliver of gray light filtered through the cracks in the shutters before I dared to move the dresser and open the bedroom door. The main room was empty, the fire long dead, the air smelling of cold ash and that lingering metallic scent of rusted iron. I walked to the front door, my hands shaking so violently I could barely work the latch, and stepped out onto the porch. The world was a ruin of broken branches and deep, muddy furrows, but it was what I saw on the walls of the cabin that made my blood turn to ice. The logs weren't just scratched. They were carved with deep, precise grooves that formed a continuous, spiraling pattern around the entire building. It wasn't random violence, but a meticulous, mathematical script, thousands of tiny lines etched into the wood with the precision of an engraver. I followed the trail of mud around the side of the house, my eyes fixed on the ground, searching for the footprints of the massive thing that had circled me. There were footprints, yes, but they weren't massive. They were the size of a normal man's feet, yet they were pressed so deep into the saturated earth they looked like they had been made by someone carrying 1,000 pounds of lead. The trail led directly to the small, wooden lattice that covered the entrance to the crawl space beneath the cabin. The lattice had been neatly removed and set aside, and the dark opening gaped like a hungry mouth. I knelt down, my breath catching in my throat, and looked into the shadows, expecting to see a face staring back. The space was empty, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw what had been left behind in the dirt. There were dozens of small, hand-carved wooden figurines, each one a perfect, haunting likeness of me, arranged in a circle around a single, larger hole drilled into the floorboards above. One of the figurines was missing its head, the wood splintered as if it had been snapped off in a fit of sudden, quiet rage. I stood up and backed away, stumbling toward my car, not caring that the tires would likely get stuck in the deep, treacherous mud. I didn't pack my bags, I didn't lock the door, and I didn't look back as I floored the engine and felt the frame of the car scrape against the earth. I drove for 3 hours before I found a gas station with a working phone, my hands still stained with the cedar dust of the cabin. When the police finally went out there a day later, they told me they found the cabin exactly as I described, carved from top to bottom in that strange, spiraling script. But they also found something I hadn't seen in my panic to leave. In the crawl space, tucked far back into the corner where the insulation had been ripped away, they found a heavy, iron suit, primitive and rusted, weighted with lead plates and lined with old, blood-stained wool. There was no one inside it, and there were no tracks leading away from the cabin except for mine. I'm back in the city now, surrounded by the noise of traffic and the glow of streetlights, but the silence still feels heavy to me. Every time it rains, I find myself standing by the window, listening for that slow, rhythmic rasping against the glass. And sometimes, when the house is very quiet, I think I can hear a soft, wet clicking sound coming from right beneath my feet. I haven't looked under my bed in weeks, and I don't think I ever will again, because I know that whatever was in that suit didn't need it to be massive. It just needed the patience to wait for the storm to end. And the storm always ends, leaving you alone with whatever stayed behind. I decided to take the cabin for the entire month of October because I really just needed to get away from the constant, grinding noise of the city, and the way people always seem to be watching you without even realizing they are doing it. It is one of those old, sturdy structures made of weathered cedar and heavy river stone that smells faintly of wood smoke and old paperback books, tucked so far back into the Cascades that you have to drive 3 miles on a rutted gravel road just to reach the mailbox. The first few days were exactly what I had hoped for, filled with the kind of absolute silence that makes your ears ring until you finally adjust to the rhythm of the wind in the pines. I spent my mornings drinking bitter black coffee on the small porch, watching the mist roll off the jagged peaks in the distance, while the squirrels chattered and fought over fallen pine cones. There wasn't another soul for miles, or at least that's what the property manager had promised me when I handed over the cash for the month-long rental. The woods were dense, a thick tapestry of ancient Douglas firs and hemlocks that seemed to swallow the light even in the middle of the afternoon. I liked the isolation at first, finding a strange sort of peace in the fact that if I screamed at the top of my lungs, the only thing that would hear me was the moss. My routine was simple and repetitive, designed to scrub the stress of my corporate life away through the sheer force of boredom and fresh air. I would wake up, chop a little wood just for the sake of the exercise, hike a mile or 2 down to the creek, and spend the evenings reading by the light of a single kerosene lamp. Around the 5th day, though, the silence started to feel less like a luxury and more like a heavy blanket that was slowly being pulled over my head. I began to notice small things that felt slightly out of place, like the way the birds would suddenly stop singing all at once at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I told myself it was just the natural cycle of the forest, some predator moving through the underbrush that I couldn't see from my vantage point on the porch. But then there was the vibration, a low-frequency hum that I felt in the soles of my feet more than I heard with my ears, pulsating through the floorboards of the cabin just as the sun began to dip below the ridge. It was so faint that I could convince myself it was just the wind catching the chimney, or perhaps a distant logging operation miles away over the next mountain. I sat there on the floor for an hour one night, my palms pressed against the wood, trying to trace the source of that rhythmic thrumming. It didn't feel like nature. It felt like the idling of a massive engine, deep underground, or perhaps just beyond the line of trees. I laughed it off, pouring myself another glass of wine and blaming my overactive imagination, which had always been a bit too vivid for my own good. The next day, the air felt different, thick and humid in a way that didn't make sense for the high elevation and the late autumn season. I went for my usual walk, but I found myself turning back early because the woods felt strangely crowded, as if the trees had stepped a few inches closer to the trail since the morning. That evening, the sunset was a violent, bruised purple that seemed to stain the sky and cast long, distorted shadows across the clearing where my cabin sat. I stood on the porch and watched the light die, feeling a sudden and inexplicable urge to lock the heavy oak door and slide the deadbolt home long before it was actually dark. I spent the evening pacing the small living area, my eyes constantly darting toward the windows even though the curtains were drawn tight. I could hear the woods clicking and groaning outside, the usual sounds of a forest at night, but there was something else underneath it all, a sound like metal scraping against stone. It was a sharp, screeching noise that lasted only a second before being swallowed by the wind, but it was enough to make the hair on my arm stand straight up. I told myself it was a branch rubbing against the roof, or maybe a deer caught in a thicket, but I knew the layout of the cabin well enough to know no branches reached that high. I eventually drifted off to sleep on the sofa, my book face down on my chest and the kerosene lamp burning low on the side table. I woke up around 3 in the morning, to a silence so profound it felt like I had gone deaf in my sleep. The humming had stopped, and even the wind had died down to nothing, leaving the cabin feeling like a tomb buried under a mountain of earth. I felt a cold draft licking at my ankles, which was strange because I had been so careful to shut all the windows and the door before I lay down. My heart started to hammer against my ribs as I reached for my heavy-duty flashlight, the one with the 5,000 lumen beam that could cut through a fog bank like a knife. I stood up slowly, my joints creaking in the stillness, and walked over to the front window that looked out toward the western tree line. I pulled the curtain back just a fraction of an inch, my breath fogging the cold glass, and peered out into the darkness of the clearing. At first, I saw nothing but the black silhouette of the trees against the starlit sky, the familiar jagged line of the mountain ridge beyond. But then I noticed a shape that shouldn't have been there, a straight line where there should have been the organic curve of a trunk or a bush. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was just a trick of the low light or a lingering dream, but the shape didn't go away. It stayed there, solid and undeniable. I took a deep breath, gripped the flashlight tight, and threw the curtain wide before clicking the power button on the light. The beam punched through the darkness, illuminating the space directly in front of the cabin, and my stomach dropped through the floor. Scattered in a perfect, equidistant circle around my clearing were 5 other cabins, each one an exact, terrifying replica of the one I was standing in. They hadn't been there when the sun went down. The space they now occupied had been filled with ancient trees and thick undergrowth just a few hours ago. My light hit the weathered cedar siding of the cabin directly across from me, and I saw the same stone chimney, the same small porch, and the same red curtains I had chosen myself. I panned the light to the left, hitting another cabin and another, until the circle was complete, hemming me in from every side. They looked like they had grown out of the ground, but the dirt around their foundations was fresh and raw, piled in dark mounds like graves. I could see the tire tracks now, massive and deep, cutting through the forest floor where the trees had been brutally cleared away in total silence. This wasn't a supernatural event. This was a feat of terrifyingly efficient human engineering, a coordinated effort that must have involved dozens of men and heavy machinery working with surgical precision while I slept. I ran to the back window, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, and saw 3 more cabins behind me, closing the loop. They were all dark, their windows like empty eyes reflecting my flashlight beam back at me, but I knew they weren't empty. I could see the faint glow of a cigarette ember on the porch of the cabin to my right, a tiny orange spark that bobbed up and down in the dark. I turned off my flashlight, suddenly terrified of being a beacon in the center of their circle, and crouched down below the windowsill. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation for why someone would move 8 identical houses into the middle of the wilderness in a single night. Was I part of some sick experiment, a social study on isolation and perceived reality, or was it something much more predatory? I reached for my phone, but the screen showed a flat no service bar, and when I tried to use the landline, all I heard was the sound of someone breathing on the other end. It wasn't a heavy breather kind of sound. It was soft, rhythmic, and patient, as if they were waiting for me to say something first. I hung up the phone with a trembling hand and backed away into the center of the room, far from the windows and the doors. Then the humming started again, but this time it was louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't coming from the ground anymore. It was coming from the other cabins, a synchronized vibration that made the glass in my windows rattle in their frames. I heard a heavy thud on my front porch, the sound of a leather-soled boot stepping onto the wood with deliberate weight. Then came another thud, and another, coming from all sides of the cabin simultaneously, a chorus of footsteps closing in on me. I looked at the front door, watching the brass handle slowly begin to turn, the metal groaning under the pressure of a firm, steady hand. There was no shouting, no demands, just the terrifyingly calm sound of someone trying to enter a home they felt they owned. I realized then that the cabins weren't just replicas, they were a set, and I was the final piece of the collection that had finally been moved into place. I retreated to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I could find, but my hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped it on the linoleum. The door handle clicked as the bolt cleared the strike plate, and the heavy oak door began to swing inward with a slow, agonizing creak. The light from the dying moon spilled across the floor, and I saw a shadow stretch long and thin into my living room. It was the shadow of a man wearing a wide-brimmed hat, his posture relaxed and casual, as if he were simply coming home after a long day of work. Behind him, across the clearing, I saw the lights in the other cabins flicker on all at once, revealing silhouettes in every single window. They were all standing there, perfectly still, watching my cabin as if they were waiting for a show to begin. The man in the doorway didn't say a word. He just stood there in the shadows, his face obscured, holding a set of keys that looked exactly like mine. I realized with a jolt of pure, icy horror that the woods were gone, replaced by a suburban nightmare that had been dropped into the heart of the wilderness just for me. I backed into the corner of the kitchen, the knife held out in front of me, but I knew it was useless against the sheer number of them. The man took a step inside, his boots thudding softly on the rug I had bought only a week ago to make the place feel more like home. He reached out and flipped the light switch, but the bulb didn't come on. Instead, a soft, pre-recorded voice began to play from a speaker I hadn't noticed hidden in the ceiling. "Welcome home," the voice said, its tone cheery and synthetic, looping over and over again until it became a meaningless drone. I looked out the window one last time and saw that the trees beyond the circle of cabins were actually just massive, painted screens, swaying slightly in the wind. I wasn't in the mountains anymore. I don't think I had been in the mountains for a very long time. The man in the doorway finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. "You missed the orientation," he said, and as he stepped into the pale moonlight, I saw that his face was a perfect, plastic mask of my own. He didn't move toward me to attack. He simply walked to the sofa and sat down, picking up the book I had been reading. He turned to the page I had marked and began to read aloud, his voice mimicking my own inflections with haunting accuracy. I ran for the back door, but when I threw it open, I found myself staring at the front door of the cabin behind mine, which was already open. Another version of me was standing there, dressed in my favorite flannel shirt, holding a steaming mug of coffee that smelled exactly like the brand I used. He waved at me, a small neighborly gesture that felt like a death sentence, and then he pointed toward the horizon. The sun was starting to rise, but it wasn't the sun. It was a massive bank of stadium lights flickering on one by one, illuminating the hundreds of identical cabins that stretched out as far as I could see. I am still standing here in the kitchen, the knife heavy in my hand, listening to the man on my sofa turn the pages of my book. The Welcome Home recording is still playing, and I can hear the sound of hundreds of doors opening all at once across the plain. I don't know where the mountain went, or how they moved me without me waking up, but I know that I am never going back to the city. I am part of the circle now, and the person in the cabin next to me is already starting his morning walk toward my porch. He has my gait, my height, and as he gets closer, I can see he is wearing the same terrified expression that I am. We are all just waiting for the next cabin to appear in the center of the ring.